Thanks everyone for joining and welcome to our talk, Cloudy with the Chance of APT. I'm Doug Bienstock. I'm a manager at Mandiant, and I've been with Mandiant for about 7 years now, which for some feels like an eternity. I'm certainly one of those. My role at Mandiant is primarily an incident response manager, so I manage a lot of the investigations that come to us in our New York City office. I also dabble a little bit in red teaming, especially on the research side of things, where I've published tools like PwnAuth for OAuth abuse, as well as, of course, ADFS dump and ADFS spoof, and some other associated research. Outside of InfoSec, I'm a lifelong Green Bay Packers fan, and I'm currently very anxiously and nervously reading the news about Aaron Rodgers, and I'm really hoping for a resolution, so we'll see what happens there. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Josh. He's going to introduce himself and get us kicked off with some content.
Thanks, Doug. My name is Josh Madeley. I am a manager of professional services at Mandiant. I've been with the company for almost 6 years, and that entire time I have been an incident response lead based out of our Boston office. Unlike Doug, I'm not an author of any publicly available tools, but if you do work at Mandiant, you've probably interacted with some code that I have written. I am a Canadian expat. I moved from Toronto to Boston in 2012, which means that I adopted the New England Patriots as my team of choice, so cue the booze. This past year has proved the point that nation-state-backed threat actors are increasingly investing time and money to develop novel ways to access data in Microsoft 365. And these actors are especially interested in Microsoft 365 because that's where more and more organizations are storing data and collaborating. And this can be some of their most confidential data like email, SharePoint, OneDrive, Power BI. So if you're an espionage-motivated threat actor, Microsoft 365 is the holy grail. So today we're going to talk about some of the lessons learned from some high-scale or large-scale espionage campaigns that we've detected over the past year. And we're going to talk through the novel techniques that they use to evade detection by disabling security features like auditing and logging, automating data theft through old techniques like Mailbox folder permissions, and some newer techniques like abusing enterprise applications. And then we're going to talk through maintaining persistent access by abusing SAML and ADFS. Throughout this talk, we're going to detail the technical underpinnings that are key to understanding and realizing these techniques. And in a few instances, we're also going to cover new extensions or facets of these techniques that have not yet been observed in the wild, but are natural extensions of the technique that organizations should be prepared to defend against in the coming weeks, months, and years. So to start, we're going to talk about avoiding detection, specifically by disabling security features. And throughout this talk, we're going to see that attackers are targeting Microsoft 365 to steal data. That's why they're there. They're not just interested in modifying data. They actually want to take it and review it and understand it. And there are some pretty stealthy ways to do this, but attackers always want to increase their stealth, make it harder to get caught, especially if they want to perpetrate this data theft over years as opposed to just a one-time smash and grab. So if we think about the analogy of, say, stealing a raw archive full of files from a file server. If we have object-level auditing enabled on this file server, we can see every archive file that is put into that, or every file that's put into that archive. The same concept applies for Office 365 or Microsoft 365. All domain admins have access to the audit logs, but if you pay for an E5 license, you have access to what's known as the advanced auditing. And this could be analogous to object-level auditing. Specifically, that comes with the Mail Items Accessed event, which is going to record any interactions with mail item objects in a mailbox. It's going to record the first 1,000 interactions in a 24-hour period, which according to Microsoft, accounts for 99% of users within the world. After that, it's throttled, and it will say so. But you can imagine this type of logging is problematic to attackers who are trying to steal data. And as of today, if mailbox auditing is enabled by default in the tenant, you can't disable it on individual mailboxes, so attackers needed to find a different way around this. Fortunately, Microsoft handed it to them in the Set Mailbox Audit Bypass Association commandlet. And what this is going to do is prevent any and all mailbox actions for specific users from being logged. I'm not entirely sure why this feature exists, but there is some reference to administrators trying to limit noise in their logs, so they bypass a couple of different users. But you'd be well served to monitor for the execution of this commandlet in your tenant. Now, what this means once it's configured is that any action or any mailbox owner actions made by the specified users that have the bypass association created are not going to be logged. It also means that delegate actions performed by the bypassed users on target mailboxes, including shared mailboxes, aren't logged. And it also means that admin actions, or certain admin actions, are not going to be logged. So this allows attackers to, if you're monitoring for data theft, to access a particular mailbox and it not generate a mail items access log. But a more efficient way that we've actually seen threat actors using to bypass logging in an environment is to downgrade the critical users from an E5 to an E3 license. Now, along with saving the organization a little bit of money, it's also going to disable the mail item access logging without degrading any of the features that the majority of users are taking advantage of on a daily basis. And these are really simple techniques once you get administrative access to a tenant to make these changes to enable long-term data theft. And we're going to talk about some of these in the next slide. So first, we're going to talk about an older technique, which is abusing mailbox folder permissions. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So mailbox folder permissions are an alternative to mailbox delegation. So within a mailbox, a user, administrator, or delegate can grant permissions to other users that allow them to access specific folders. You can think about sharing calendars, allowing administrative assistants to look at particular folders or particular content that is moved around for them. But just like administrators, attackers who have acquired sufficient permissions to a mailbox or a tenant can modify these permissions to allow them to access the folder contents. This is an older technique that was actually documented by Bo Bullock at Black Hills Information Security. But the reason we're talking about it today is that we recently saw an APT threat actor lose access to multiple environments using a sophisticated means of targeting mailboxes, only to fall back on this old school method of abusing mailbox folder permissions. And I think what was even more fascinating is that when they fell back on this method, there were no modifications made to the environment to enable it during the time of our investigation, which meant that those changes had been made a long time before. So just like local folders, mailbox folder permissions can be assigned through either individual permissions or roles, which are just collections of folder permissions. Ultimately, though, the threat actors are going to be after roles that have the read items permission. And as its name implies, it grants access to the contents of the folders to a specific user or group. So author, editor, non-editing author, owner, publishing editor, these are all roles that have the read items permission. And we have the reviewer role noted here because that's the one that we've actually seen threat actors use. And it is also the one that Bo Bullock talked about in his post on using Mail Sniper to accomplish this. Now, folder permissions can be assigned to users and mail-enabled security groups. In addition to the users within the tenant, there are two special users. There's the anonymous user, which accounts for any external unauthenticated user, which sounds pretty scary, but in practice, neither Doug or myself have been able to get this to work as advertised. We haven't been able to take advantage of that anonymous permission set to abuse mailbox folder permissions. And then there is the default user, also known as the everyone user, depending on what log you're looking at. And this includes any internal authenticated user. Now, by default, the access for both users is set to none, so they can't do anything. But a threat actor can take advantage of this, and what we have seen is that they're going to assign the default user the reviewer role to the top of the information store and every folder underneath it to allow any authenticated user access to the mailbox folder. Now, these permissions don't automatically cascade down from child to parent, so the threat actor needed to intentionally modify each subfolder. But any new folders that the user creates, the threat actor will have access to. And this can trivially be done by using the set mailbox folder permission commandlet or a tool like EWS Editor or Mail Sniper or a custom built application that makes EWS API calls. Now, the threat actor still needs to maintain some level of access to the environment via a valid account, but they don't need to, once they've made this modification, they don't need to maintain access to an account or to the specific accounts that they want to target on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. So they can use one compromised account to access 10 modified or mailboxes that have modified folder permissions. Now, to detect this mechanism, we want to look for EWS sign-ins that are then being used to access the modified folders. In Azure Active Directory, these are going to be coded as non-interactive sign-ins. And it's important to note that these are Azure AD logs, so they're not going to be forwarded to the unified audit log. And they must be specifically enabled to forward to some sort of SIM or ingested into Microsoft Sentinel. Alternatively, you can look for the execution or the use of the set mailbox folder permission or the set mailbox permission commandlet within your unified audit log. Keep in mind, though, that there's going to be a lot of noise from legitimate admin activity as well as some background Exchange Online activity. If you have mail items accessed auditing enabled, you can also look for any patterns of non-owner access to high-value targeted or high-value mailboxes. A final method you can use is to enumerate the mailbox folder permissions with PowerShell and look for any evidence of the default user having the reviewer permission or the everyone users having reviewer permission. And this, it doesn't scale well if you have 150,000 users in your tenant, but you can be targeting high-value users or users that fit within a particular threat model. So you can see threat actors can steal data using this kind of older method, but it still requires them to maintain a valid account. And if you're changing passwords every 90 days, this can be problematic because they have to come back in and recompromise and risk getting detected. A better way to maintain access to mailboxes would be to hijack an enterprise application or an app registration. Now, both app registrations and enterprise applications are referred to as applications or Azure AD applications, but there are some key differences that we want to discuss in the context of abuse. App registrations are the initial instance of an application that lives within the tenant that created the app. And this effectively serves as the blueprint to create a service principal in any tenant that is going to be consuming or using that application. A good example of this would be Exchange Online. It's located within the Microsoft Corporation tenant, but the service principal that you interact with as a consumer on a daily basis is going to exist within your tenant, and it is modeled off of the blueprint in the Microsoft Corporation tenant. Then we have enterprise applications, also known as service principals. And these are that copy of the app registration that live in your tenant, or these are going to be custom applications that you have made in your tenant. Now, everything within Microsoft 365 uses applications, or this model of applications, to interact with each other. So if you need to make API calls to Office or to Microsoft 365, if you need to interact with data, it's going to be done through an application. So if you go through your tenant right now, there's going to be a bunch of service principals that you've probably never heard of, but there's going to be one for every application that you're using. And Microsoft services are designated as first-party service principals, so they have a different level of access to the tenant that's not otherwise afforded to any custom apps that you create. But it is important to note that everything within Microsoft 365, every application, every interaction, is going to be reliant on some sort of application use. Now, effectively, applications are an OAuth authentication mechanism. So the applications provide the OAuth entity that is going to be authenticating to different services, and they're going to have different permissions applied to them. And depending on how the application is being used, there's going to be a different type of permission. So we have delegated permissions, which are going to enable apps to perform API operations on behalf of a user. So this is going to be limited to data that the user has access to. So effectively, that user is going to consent to this application at runtime, or they're going to consent to the permissions at runtime. And then that application is going to act as the user. A good example of this would be a morning digest application that reads your emails, calendar, and task, and then reads your Gmail, calendar, and tasks, and collates them all into a cohesive unit. The API calls that application is making to pull your emails are being made by the application on your behalf using your permissions. Application permissions, on the other hand, enable apps to perform API operations without a signed-in user, and they're allowed to access tenant-wide data. Now, this does require admin consent, but once that administrative consent is provided, the application acts as itself. It doesn't act on behalf of the administrator. Now, both app registrations and enterprise applications can be assigned permissions. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a couple slides and how that affects applications that you trust from third parties. But before we go any further, we do need to talk about authentication, because you can't just create an application with permissions and then expect it to be able to authenticate to the services. You need to create a secret or a certificate that allows the application to authenticate as the identity of the app. And this is roughly analogous to API keys. Applications can have multiple secrets or certificates associated with them. They can have multiple API keys. But once they're created, once you create this API key, you can't extract it from Azure AD, from the Azure AD key store. There's no Mimikatz equivalent that you can run, or at least that I'm aware of, that will extract the plain text credentials for that API key. What this means is that the threat actor is going to need to create their own secrets or certificates for an application that they want to access. Now, both app registrations and enterprise apps, so both the blueprint and the service principal, can have secrets assigned to them. However, you can only assign credentials to an enterprise application via PowerShell. You can't do that through the Azure portal. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork for how Azure applications work, the high-level fundamentals for the permissions, and the mechanisms for authenticating, it seems pretty obvious how attackers are abusing them. What we have seen is attackers identify an existing service principal inside of a tenant that they want to hijack. And to hijack them, what they would do is add the MS Graph application permissions specifically the file.read and mail.read permissions that allow them to, as the name suggests, read mail and read files within the tenant. Then to authenticate, the threat actor would add new credentials. And these can be either secrets or certificates. And we've actually seen threat actors use both, and we haven't fully figured out why they pick one over the other, but ultimately they add these credentials to act as their API keys. Once they have done this, they have remote access to make API calls to the Microsoft Graph. So every day, an attacker would log in and extract the last 24 hours of emails from a set group of mailboxes. Now, we hadn't seen them target every mailbox in a tenant. That would be too much data, but we did see them target the last 24 hours of a couple hundred mailboxes that fit within their espionage campaign, or with the data that they were after. Now, some of you may be saying, well, we have conditional access policies that limit how people access our environment. Those don't get applied to applications, which means that the threat actor can access or can authenticate to the graph from anywhere in the world. And to make matters worse, service principal sign-ins weren't even available, or sign-in logs weren't even available until mid-2020, when, and even then, they're only recorded in Azure AD, and they need to be forwarded to a SIEM if you want to do any sort of meaningful analytics on them. Fortunately, Microsoft is paying close attention to where applications are authenticating from in the back end, so it is making it a little bit more difficult for threat actors to abuse them. Now, we talk about app registrations. Because these can be created as multi-tenants, customers can add your app to their tenant. And the app registration remains as that master copy, or the blueprint, that is linked to all of the existing enterprise apps that are registered in the customer tenants. So if we compromise that app registration, that master copy, we can access the data in any of the customer tenants. So you really have to think about how you're trusting your business partners or applications that you've added to your tenants. And all we need to do is use the friendly name of the application that we want, or the friendly name of the tenant, I should say, that we want to access, Microsoft.com, yourcompanyinc.com, to access the data. Now, there's a couple caveats here. The permissions set that the app registration has is going to be the minimum of what the particular app is granted in the consuming tenant, or the consuming tenant service principal. Which also means that modifications to the app registration don't automatically propagate down to the consuming tenants. So a threat actor can't just add the mail.read permission and expect it to work in all of the consuming tenants. It still requires an administrator to consent. But if the app already has the mail.read permission, they can leverage that. Additionally, though, if the threat actor adds a new credential to an app registration, that exists outside of the blueprint, and that that credential can be used to authenticate. That new credential can be used to authenticate to all of the consuming tenants. So this is pretty scary, because you can trust an application. You think that you've got a service principal, and that's the entity that you're going to be interacting with, and an attacker can't access your service principal because your security is really good. But now the security of the service that you're trusting is now in question. You have to focus very carefully on that and what permissions you're giving it access to. And to further complicate matters, defenders, in our experience, don't really understand the intricacies of Azure AD apps. There's a lot of new terminology that's, if you live in an Amazon world, that is very different, or if you live in a GCP world, it's very different. This is a very new frontier for defenders. And combine that with the fact that logging is pretty minimal and it's less than intuitive, there's a big blind spot for defenders to realize that data could be being mass exported from their environment without any sort of alarm bells ringing. Like I said before, fortunately, Microsoft is paying attention to this issue, and they are proactively monitoring for abuse of Azure AD apps. So with that said, I want to hand it over to Doug to talk about SAML abuse and ADFS. Doug?
Thanks, Josh. Now we're going to move into some ADFS techniques, specifically Golden SAML. So before we get into Golden SAML, I want to give a little bit of a quick one-slide walkthrough on the ADFS web authentication flow. So we've got our user here on the bottom. They're going to try and log into Office 365. So they go to the website, they enter their username, and then we go through a process called Home Realm Discovery, where Office 365 is going to kick me back to my ADFS login page, which is being proxied by our web application proxy in the DMZ. Now that's really just a dumb reverse proxy for the real ADFS server, which is going to be sitting somewhere in that corporate network, right? So I enter my username and password. ADFS is going to pass that over to, in most cases, Active Directory to make our actual authentication decision. If that authentication is successful, then it's going to provide back some information to ADFS, things like my username, maybe my group memberships, maybe when the password expires. These are all provided in what are called claims, which are really just little snippets of information about the identity or the user that's authenticating. Now, ADFS is going to take those claims and transform them into new claims. It could be simple, such as pass through the username, or it could be more complex, like transform it, add some text to it, and it's going to package those claims into a security token, which is called a SAML token. Now that SAML token is just an XML text document. It's going to contain those pieces of information, those claims, and then the security of that document, or how Office 365 knows it's a valid token, is facilitated through a digital signature. And that digital signature is using a private key called the ADFS token signing key, which sits on the ADFS server. So you can imagine pretty easily if an attacker were able to get their hands on that ADFS token signing key, they could create SAML tokens arbitrarily and access any cloud application that is federated to ADFS, right? So the real bedrock of security for ADFS is that token signing key, and we want to keep it out of the hands of attackers. So shifting our focus or our viewpoint to that attacker viewpoint, how do we get our hands on that ADFS token signing key? Well, the first step is we need the encrypted key. There are a couple of ways to get it, but what we're going to focus on is how it's stored in the ADFS configuration database. And it's packed into this encrypted blob, which I have on the screen for us now. So there's, of course, going to be the ciphertext, but there's also a lot of associated information that we need to perform the decryption, things like the nonce and the initialization vector for the decryption routine. We also have a MAC value so that we can validate that we decrypted the proper ciphertext or clear text. So how do we actually perform this decryption? We first need some secret material. And that secret material is using a technology called DKM, or Distributed Key Manager, which is basically a fancy way of storing secrets inside of Active Directory. And so that secret is stored in this ADFS group in a contact object, specifically in a thumbnail photo attribute of that contact object. Now, by default, only the ADFS service account and some highly privileged groups like domain admins can read that key. Now, the DKM value is not used by itself to decrypt the token signing certificate. It's actually used as input to a key derivation function. And the key derivation function that we're using is a NIST standard. It's a HMAC SHA-256 derivation function. And it mostly, but not exactly, follows the standard defined by NIST. And this is important because as a red teamer or as attackers, if we just use, for example, the standard Python cryptography package, we're going to run into issues. We actually need to tweak some of the parameters for that function in order to get the proper key. Now, the other inputs are going to be taken out of that encrypted blob that I showed a couple of slides ago. So we have the nonce, we have the IV, we have what's called a context. All of that goes into this function, and then we get the actual AES symmetric key to use for decryption. So at this point, we have a valid token signing key, but how do we actually create a SAML token that, for example, Office 365 will accept? Well, it relies on something called claims issuance rules. And so anyone who's dabbled in ADFS this will be familiar to you. But I've got an example of some of the claim issuance rules for Office 365 on this slide. And it uses kind of a custom language that is documented by Microsoft that falls into two parts. We have a condition, and then we have the actual issuance rule. So it could be very simple, such as take the claim that's incoming and just spit it out into the SAML token, or it could be more complex, right? Now, the order of these rules matters. It's very important because they're evaluated chronologically. So if we as attackers don't follow the order of these rules to the letter, we're going to get a different set of resulting claims, which means that Office 365 or Dropbox, whatever we're trying to access, it might not accept our SAML token. Or we may add additional claims that aren't necessary. And for anyone who is following the UNC 2452, the SolarWinds stuff, some of the Office 365 tools were looking for a user authentication method value of, I think it was 16457. And that value is just a bitmap of the different claims in the token. So as defenders, that's kind of neat because we can kind of baseline what that value is and then look for outliers. The sort of unfortunate thing is that value was never intended to be exposed to defenders. So if you search for that value in your unified audit log or in your Azure sign-in logs, you're not going to see it anymore. So as defenders, we cannot do any detecting based on abnormal claims. Now, Microsoft can see the claims in the token to a degree because they can see that user authentication method value. So they may be monitoring, right? And it's important that if we're red teamers or threat actors, we want to as closely match a legitimate SAML token as possible. The last piece of information that we want to focus on is that token lifetime, right? So how long are these SAML tokens valid for? Now, this is configurable per relying party trust, which is per cloud application we're trying to access. We can find that in the ADFS database. We can also get it using PowerShell. Now, a default value of 0 means 60 seconds, but we could set it for longer. There's nothing to say that we can't make this a year or 3 years. The only things to keep in mind are the SAML token is evaluated when you provide it to that application you're trying to access. So if we make a SAML token with a validity period of 5 years, but the underlying private public key pair is only valid for 1, the SAML token's not going to be valid, right? The other thing to keep in mind is, well, this is an anomaly. This is something that defenders can key in on. And again, we run into a situation where actual enterprise defenders cannot see this value. So it does not show up in the logs. It will not show up in your SIM. It's not something you can build rules for. Microsoft, however, can see this value on their backend, and especially after last year's UNC 2452 spree, they're probably monitoring for this. So again, as red teamers, threat actors, they're going to want to closely mimic this. And 60 minutes is a pretty long time, right, in kind of the digital realm. So this is all cool, but what can we really do with this? Well, as threat actors, as red teamers, our goal is always going to be persistence, right? How can we access this data for as long as possible? And so it turns out one thing we can do is we can actually add a second token signing certificate to ADFS. We can have 2 valid certificates at the same time. And the reason for this is token signing certificate rollover, right? This is managed by ADFS. And in order to avoid outages, there is actually the space for 2 token signing certificates so that one can expire in 30 days, a new one can be created, and then you have a little bit of overlap, right? And in fact, both signing certificates can be valid at the same time, and there's nothing to say that one signing certificate can be valid for the default period of 1 year, and another one, like we see in the screenshot, be valid for 5 years. So I can create my secondary token signing certificate, I can add it to ADFS, or if I have global administrator privileges, I could bypass ADFS entirely and just add it to Office 365. We can then create and mint our own tokens for as long as we want, 5 years, 20 years, 100 years. Until someone notices the secondary certificate and gets rid of it, we can create valid token signing certificates. So a very powerful persistence mechanism. And in fact, as Defenders, there is an event log message that gets generated when a new token signing certificate is added, but there's no like built-in alerting, right? We'll need to create some custom SIM rules if we want to detect this. And we're going to have to do some baselining, right? Because this process happens automatically when ADFS performs rollovers. And unfortunately, the event log message does not tell us anything about the cert. So we can't create some baselines to say, hey, tell me whenever a certificate is valid for longer than 1 year. We kind of just need to see this alert, maybe establish a pattern, or maybe just have someone manually check that new cert. So let's move on to some new techniques, ADFS replication. And when I was doing the ADFS spoof and dump research a couple years ago, I always was thinking, well, what can we do to go further? This technique is pretty cool, it's pretty powerful, but it relies on a threat actor gaining access to the ADFS server. And hopefully, mature organizations are treating that ADFS server as tier 0, which means it's going to be hard to get at. So is there any way that we could do this over the network? And it turns out that we can with ADFS replication. So you can imagine that larger organizations, geographically dispersed organizations, they don't want just one ADFS server, they want multiple. And those servers are going to exist in what's called a farm. So we have multiple farm nodes, and by default, they're all going to use the same configuration, and they're all going to use the same secrets. They're going to use the same token signing certificate. So these nodes keep the information in sync by using a replication service. And this replication service is going to be served on the primary ADFS server, which is just the first ADFS server that we install the role on, or the first Windows server that we install that role on. So replication is going to be making use of something called the Windows Communication Foundation, or WCF, which is really just another .NET framework that allows us to really easily build client-server applications. So it kind of abstracts away all of the stuff that as developers we don't really want to focus on. So the channels that communication is going to occur over, which in this case is HTTP, and things like message security and authentication and authorization, which in this case is going to be WS security and Kerberos. So that replication service is going to be accessible over a well-known URI, which I have here on the slide. Authentication is going to use WS Trust SB Nego using Kerberos. And then you can see that this is over port 80, so it's over cleartext HTTP, but the actual data payloads are going to be encrypted using a shared secret that's derived from the Kerberos session keys. So even though this is, cleartext HTTP, the actual data payloads are encrypted. So we can't just sit on the wire and snoop on the traffic, on the replication traffic. Now, I mentioned that replication is using some sort of authorization, right? There's going to be a decision made to see if a WCF client can, in fact, perform this replication. And that authorization is going to use a policy which sits on the ADFS server in that configuration database. And it's just some XML text, which I have here on the slide. This is the default ADFS authorization policy. And there are two main rules. The first we can see is a user SID. This is just the user SID for the ADFS service account in my test lab. And the second is a group SID. And so we can actually see this is a little bit more permissive than maybe we would think. Any member of the local administrators group on the ADFS server can in fact perform a replication. So even though we're still getting an encrypted value, we're still getting an encrypted token signing cert, we've now expanded the attack surface, right? Previously, we needed to run some code on the ADFS server, and we needed to compromise the ADFS service account. Now we can actually get this secret value from anywhere on the network, and in fact, we don't even need the ADFS service account. We can use any local admin. So maybe domain admin, maybe that's for whatever reason easier to get credentials for than that single ADFS service account. So how do we actually do the replication? Well, again, it turns out it's pretty easy, and the reason is WCF. It extracts away a lot of what we as developers or tool developers would need to do. And on the slide here, you see in just a few lines, this is really all the code you need to request using the WCF client the particular endpoint to get the encrypted token signing certificate. You call a function, or you're actually sending a message with the get state operation. Now there's some more code that you need, but it's really all boilerplate. And the entire POC that I wrote, which I will not be releasing, is about 150 lines of code. And you can see some other of my peers wrote a tool in PowerShell, for example, which kind of reverse engineered a lot of the actual network protocols. But you get the same result there. You get the encrypted token signing certificate. So thinking forward to persistence, like what can I actually do with this? How can I persist my access to, for example, Office 365 for longer, or maybe a la DC Shadow, how can I, as a threat actor, as a red teamer, when I recompromise a network, go from domain user to control of ADFS in just one click? And so it's actually pretty straightforward, right? We can imagine that when I compromise the network, I elevate my privileges to domain admin, for example. The first thing I do is I edit the object ACL to include a new access control entry for that DKM key to allow all domain users to read it. So now any domain user can get that DKM key. I can also really easily create a new authorization policy to authorize the group SID for domain users to access the replication service using a WCF client. So now, when I recompromise the network as a domain user, all of the permissions are in place for me to establish a WCF client, call that getState operation, and I now have the means to decrypt the ADFS token signing certificate from anywhere on the network as any user. So this is really powerful, and we're asking the question why, or why are we going to do this? Well, I think that's easy. We want persistent access to information, and more often than not, that information is going to be in Office 365, right? Whether it's email, whether it's Teams messages, whether it's files on SharePoint. As a nation-state actor with intelligence collection requirements, that's going to be the bulk of what I want, or as a red teamer, that's probably a pretty high importance objective. And we're aided by some of the default configurations in ADFS when we're performing this attack. The first is, by default, ADFS is going to expose port 80 to all systems using the Windows firewall. The ADFS role actually creates some default firewall rules for us to allow all port 80 traffic. And you can imagine, well, that makes sense, right? If I'm trying to access something as an end user using web authentication, I'm going to need to access it over the web. It turns out that's slightly wrong. You definitely need port 443, right? Because as a user authenticating, I'm going to be doing this over TLS. But we don't actually need to expose port 80 to all systems. The only ADFS service that's using port 80 is that replication service, and the only clients that should be accessing that are other ADFS servers. We also have some logging settings going for us. We have some stealth built in. The first is that replication events are not logged at all. So nowhere, not in the security event logs, not in the ADFS log itself. That's not logged anywhere. The only way that you'll see this in the event log is if you enable WCF tracing, which, to be honest, no one's going to do because it's extremely chatty. Editing that ADFS configuration database is also not logged anywhere, so we can make changes to that, and as long as we don't mess up, as long as we don't invalidate the configuration, no one's really going to be the wiser. And then lastly, editing domain object ACLs, there's some really great research out there and talks out there about how you can enable auditing for that, but I think the organization that enables that is going to be very few and far between. So we definitely have some things going for us here with this technique. And then, the attack surface I already talked about a little bit, but it's worth noting that you don't need to target the primary ADFS server. So, if you're sitting off in some data center far away and that primary server is VLANed off, you can actually access the replication service by any ADFS server, even the secondary server. It's just going to service that request for you. And if your ADFS environment you're targeting is using a SQL Server backend, which is not the default, this will work as well, right? So, it's a pretty powerful technique if we're, for whatever reason, able to get domain admin privileges, but not ADFS service account privileges. We can still get the ADFS signing key, we can still decrypt it, and then we can create this kind of ADFS backdoor to give ourselves persistent access to that token signing key. So that's all we have for today. If we'll have any questions, they'll be in the chat, I think. If not, you have my and Josh's Twitter. And thanks, guys, for listening.